When I first talked to Kaitlan and reached out and asked her to speak with you, uh, she responded almost immediately. It's like, I love the idea. That was in June. um, it's taken so long, not because the enthusiasm has diminished, I don't think, but I think it's more of a measure of the pace of the news that everybody, including you all, have been managing over the past 6 months. But from the volatile domestic politics to conflicts around the world, the portfolio only continues to grow, and the challenge is to make sense of it. And that's why she's here. She's going to try to help us make sense of it by talking about the craft a little bit, and by also sort of laying the groundwork for what we're facing in 2024, including bowl games. So I'll hand it over to Kaitlan and thank her for coming.
Well, thank you for having me. And I was very excited. So really, when you emailed me, normally there's like a lot of deliberation about just committing to things because it is so crazy and I hate having to cancel. So I'm super happy to be here and to talk to you guys. And I'm really excited to take your questions because, that's what I wanted when I was, in this position was guidance and to hear from people who knew what it's like to actually go through it, especially like when you're in your early 20s, mid 20s and seeing what's next and trying to navigate it. And I think so much of journalism is on the job training. Like you cannot be prepared for everything that you're going to encounter. And the big thing that you can do to kind of combat that is learn from people who have been there. And my life has changed so much just in the last, 8 years alone. And I was reflecting on this on my way home. I just got back from Israel for the second time since October 7th on Saturday. And it was kind of one of those moments where I was getting ready to go home for Thanksgiving. My little brother was actually in town, and I got a call at 10:30 in the morning from my boss asking if I wanted to go to Israel that night. And I was like, yeah. Like for a second, I was like thinking of how disappointed my family would be that I was totally canceling on them. But it's really meaningful to be there and to be on the ground covering stories. And I always like to, I'm like a reporter at heart. I love to cover stories on the ground. And so I was just reflecting on the way back though, on like what it means to be able to go to somewhere like that has been through something like October 7th, to hear what's happening now, not just from the family's perspectives, from doctors who are in Gaza, from parents of soldiers who are in the IDF who are worried about their kids, and to be there and to speak to these people who are so willing to tell their stories really just shows you what the importance of journalism is and what your job is. And, we get caught up in there's a lot of politics, there's a lot of things going on, as we look ahead to the 2024 election, and all of that's so important. But I think at the heart of what you're learning and what you're doing and what you're trying to do every single day is to tell people's stories and to tell them from a human perspective. And I think that is so powerful. And that's something you really won't ever learn in a classroom. You learn it when you're there with these people, speaking to them and staying in touch with them and following up with them. And it just speaks to the power of the platform you have as a reporter and what your responsibility is. And to make sure you're telling it from every angle, not just one that's, more easily available, and making sure that you strike that balance, I think is really important. And thinking about it on the way home, I was just reflecting on how important that is and how crucial that is today more than ever, when we're on Twitter, we're on Threads, Facebook, Instagram. There's so much misinformation out there, and the way to push back on that is going to be the challenge of like the next, several decades for our profession. But being a human on the ground and covering it and taking it seriously and knowing your platform and your responsibility, I think is huge and is a really big part of that. And so I really just want to hear your questions on anything when it comes to how to approach the work, how to maybe change from one platform to another, one perspective to another. Like, I just want to hear what your thoughts are on that, because I know I had a million questions when I got into this business on this. And so much of it was just sitting in the White House booth and learning from my CNN colleagues who had been covering either politics in Arkansas for 10 years and then moved to the White House, or were out in California covering, local government, or just, had gone from being in print to working for cable news and just had such a different perspective that's really where I gained the wealth of information that I use today to do my reporting on an everyday basis. And it made such a difference for me just to watch and learn from other people. So I'm really curious what your questions are. So if anyone wants to get started, I would love to start with that.
Hi, I'm Diana with the Washington Post, and I kind of cover general breaking news and politics. So it's like all the topics at once, basically. And I know that you kind of, cover a lot of things that are not just like one specific beat. How do you keep yourself not only organized, but also aware of what's going on and things that are like maybe not the story of the week, but you're going to have to deal with next week? Like, how do you keep everything together?
Great question. I'm not sure I've perfected that yet. I was literally thinking about that today, especially after being in Israel for like 12 days and then coming home and like turning your politics brain back on is like, that's like what we're leaving with right now as of tonight at 9 o'clock. We'll see if anything changes in between now and then, but we're 6 weeks away from Iowa. So it's like, okay, like let's start focusing on what's going on with the campaigns, what's happening here. It's tough because so much of your success will come from being persistent and following up on stories that maybe not everyone is chasing. You want to be, especially as a breaking news reporter, obviously you have to focus on what's happening in that moment and anticipate what could be coming. But also a lot of good reporting comes from staying in touch with certain sources or following up on, okay, this hearing's going to happen on the Hill next week, so I want to be watching what's happening here in anticipation of that. A lot of it I just have in my calendar, like certain things. Like yesterday, or on Saturday when I was flying back, I had like 8 hours to kill on my flight, and I was bored out of my mind. But I was looking at what's coming up, and so like Trump is testifying in his civil fraud trial next Monday. So I was emailing my booking team on a Saturday, God bless them. And I was like, let's book Maggie Haberman from the New York Times. And it's 2 weeks out, but I was like, or a week and a half out. But I was like, let's book her because we know we'll want her perspective on this. And so from a show perspective, it's also booking guests who will be, who do you want to hear from that night on, what the story is that day. From reporting, a lot of it's like keeping things in your calendar and just keeping an eye on what's coming. On a daily basis, I just read a lot. And it's like, to get through my email traffic in the morning is insane. But I do all the newsletters, Politico, Axios, Punchbowl, everything, the morning from the New York Times. Read Twitter, I watch CNN in the morning. And I kind of just make sure I'm like on the phone and talking to people, because really talking to sources sometimes is the best way to stay focused on what's to come. Like I'll have one source that I check in with on the Trump gag order stuff. And they're like, well, we're expecting it in this window. So they kind of help keep you, they may have a better window into when something could happen than, just your organization. But a lot of it's teamwork and working with people and just reading anything and everything to try to stay on top of it. But you really can't, that it gets you like 90% of the way there, but there's always going to be something unexpected that happens that you just, part of, I think, in being in breaking news, which all of us really are, because all news is breaking, it feels like, is just being ready to drop what you're working on and turn quickly to something else and embrace that. And instead of being like, well, this sucks because I was working on this and this is what I've been like investing in, you got to be able to pivot really quickly to what's going on. It's a good question. It's not easy.
Hi, I'm Naomi with the Washington Examiner.
Hi.
I would just be curious to know what your interview tips are, because I think that what I enjoy watching you on television is like you have these like spontaneous moments in interviews where you're like, wait, did I just make news? Like, how do you prepare? And then like, I guess like, like active listening, is that something that you've learned on the job?
Oh my God.
Like that?
It's hard to active listen. It's not that you're not, everyone's like, people say just listen in interviews and that's like the key. It is, but it's really difficult to do because it's not that you're not listening, but when you go into an interview and you do all this prep and you've got, what you think is going to be the progression of the interview, it could get totally thrown off on like the first question, and you've got to be ready to pivot. And so part of it, and this is kind of something you learn with the more interviews you do, and I always want there to be news. Like that is like my like number one driver. So if I hear something that sounds, if I'm interviewing someone, I've pretty much watched every interview they've done lately, so I'm familiar with what they're going to say. So I'll know if they're saying something different. And I think sometimes, what I learned from being in the White House briefings that was really helpful was people don't always come out, especially lawmakers and officials, and signal that they're making news. Sometimes they do it really discreetly, or they say it kind of in a boring, low-key way. So you really have to listen, because they're not just going to come out and say, well, actually, I'd like to announce that we are hiring so-and-so. Like, sometimes it's more discreet. And I'm trying to, actually, a moment of this that I remember was when Jen Psaki was the press secretary and we were in the briefing. They had been saying that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was imminent, I think starting in like December. And obviously imminent, you can't exactly predict it, but it sounds like it's going to happen any moment now. And they stopped using that language. And I noticed it in the briefing that she'd called on a few people before me and she wasn't using it. And so I asked, is this a policy change? You're not saying it's imminent. And she didn't really answer at first. And then I asked again, and she said, essentially, yeah, we're no longer calling it imminent. So it's so much of just mastering what you're covering and knowing your subject well, I think helps you understand when you're making news. And that's really what you want to do if you're interviewing a lawmaker or an elected official. That's, if you're interviewing a family, it's different. But I think going into an interview, the best thing you can do is prep beforehand. You really have to do a lot of the legwork before, and I'll research a subject, I'll watch all their interviews. If there's something that I don't fully understand, if I'm interviewing Secretary Austin at the Pentagon, I'll call our Pentagon correspondent and talk through it with them, because they watch it every single day. I check it really closely, but they're a little bit more closely aligned with it. So a lot of it's outsourcing to your team, I think, is really helpful, and to other reporters. And so that's a big part of it. I think most of the work that you do for an interview happens before the interview. But then when you're in the interview, you got to be prepared to, if they go down a rabbit hole, take it that rabbit hole, because, you want to make sure it stays on course, but if it's newsworthy and worth pursuing, you're going to want to go down that route.
Hey there, Kirsten Garris, Cox Media Group. And I know, for me, I feel like I've watched, even this last year, you've changed so many different roles and whatnot. How have you tried to find your own voice as you are changing beats and even shows, day parts? What has helped you, or, where do you find yourself kind of going with your new voice as you now anchor a show versus, being on the White House beat per se?
It's tough because it's really different. And I knew it would be a challenge. But I've been at the White House, for so long. I covered all of Trump and I covered 2 years of Biden almost. And when you're on a beat, which I think is a great job, because you're focused then on one subject, you kind of can know all your sources and develop them and cultivate them. And I think that's a really good way to establish yourself as a reporter, is just to have one beat, whatever that beat is: transportation, Capitol Hill, the White House, the Justice Department, any beat. Those are, I'm just thinking of government ones, but there's so many. And I think that helped make me better at my job now. But as an anchor, you're not just doing one subject. We're doing 5 stories a night pretty much with our commercial breaks in the show. And each of those stories has a million layers to it. So you do have to be more well-read in on everything, not just your portfolio that you're responsible for. And the best part about it, though, has been it's more conversational. The White House coverage is you're going to briefings, you're talking to sources, you're trying to break news, and you're delivering your reports for 2 minutes on TV. Even though they'll wrap you before then, and you're like, okay, I get it. I worked all day on this story, but I'll stop talking. But being an anchor, it's more of you're like, okay, if someone's at home at 9 p.m. and they've been at work all day and they haven't watched the news, what's the smartest way for us to present the news to them? And the most interesting way. And, how do we have a conversation about Israel and Trump's trials and the Iowa caucuses? And also at the end of the show, we want to talk about what happened with the college football playoff selection committee. We want to kind of have a well-rounded show. So we think about it totally differently. We are doing it tonight at the end of the show. So, but it's how do you kind of run the gamut and cover not just one thing. My dad is watching. He's not big into foreign policy or super well versed in what's happening internationally, but I know he'll care about what I say about who I have on about college football. So we just kind of approach it differently, and it's either one thing we try to focus on are one-on-one interviews that are newsworthy and interesting conversations, or have on really smart analysts who are good at, talking about that. And so it's been, I've grown a lot in the last year. You're never going to stop growing as a reporter. You will constantly be learning. You're not just going to hit 32 and be like, okay, I've got everything down. Like, I'm good for the rest of my life. I think you're constantly evolving and learning how to cover things. And so that's kind of what the last year has been like for me. Like, I'm learning how to be more of like a moderator of the show and of the conversation instead of like a guest on the show, which was kind of what I was doing before. And it's been really fun. I love both. They have different challenges for each one. And, but it's been really, I've loved being an anchor because you can kind of cover more things. Like, I probably would not have gone to Israel for 12 days as a White House reporter. I would have gone maybe with Biden, but not, for a long period. And it's kind of nice to be on the ground for a longer period of time because you can really invest in the story, meet with sources. You have a really good feel for what's changing and what's going on and what's coming next when you're really invested in it. The morning show was a really early wake-up call. So that was 3:30 a.m. was brutal. That is a lesson I don't need to learn again. But you know what? It's kind of like paying your dues. Like, it's kind of good that you do it. And it's like, that's the other thing I think for any beat that you're covering. It's just approaching the work with like an intensity and an energy that you're lucky to do this job. It's a great job. It's not easy. It has a lot of challenges that come with it, but it's an amazing gig and you get to see the world in a way that other people just don't. And sometimes you will be working late hours, early mornings, weekends, holidays. Maybe you'll miss a friend's birthday dinner or something like that. And I've done all of that. My friends would tell you. But it always feels worth it to me to do the work because you feel good about it at the end. And even if it's not, perfect, I think if you really apply yourself, I've always felt that that's like the most rewarding thing in any beat or role that I've played at CNN. It's a good question.
Hi, I'm Minnie Raker. I work with Time Magazine.
Hi.
I have two questions. One's very specific, one more general.
Okay.
The specific one, I've spent some time this year covering Vivek Ramaswamy, and I covered your exchange on 9/11 a little bit, and I'm curious what that was like internally for you and how you felt about his and his team's reaction afterwards. That's one question. Second one is like, you're so successful at such a young age, and there's a lot of young, good journalists, but they're not all as successful as you. And I'm curious, like, what do you most credit for your success?
We'll start with Vivek, who did call me a petulant teenager after that interview, which I did not appreciate. Because I always try to approach interviews in a good faith way, and I'm never trying to do like gotcha. That just is not my style. But I am curious in following up with people, and I hate when people kind of say something halfway but don't fully say it, and then it's kind of signaling to some people they're saying it, but they can still have plausible deniability, which is what I felt like he was doing on 9/11. And so that's another benefit of like, we had just been listening to things he had been saying, and sources had flagged to me, he's been making some strange comments on 9/11, like, you should look into this. And so I did. And he was kind of implying that, which this, but for everyone else who doesn't, if you weren't covering it closely, he was kind of implying that 9/11, like conspiracies about 9/11, and that federal agents were on the planes. And then he had the Atlantic interview where he really leaned into it. And so we had him on, but I wanted to give him a chance to kind of explain himself. I wasn't saying, that he was directly saying there was a conspiracy on 9/11, but we were like, okay, this is what you said. This is what you're quoted as saying. Can you explain that? And he denied saying it in the interview, which I knew the reporter who had interviewed him is very good, and I had no reason to doubt them. And so we went down, he was arguing, and he was, always in turn, they'll blame the media. If you're interviewing a lawmaker and they don't like what you're asking, they'll say, well, the media always does this. And I think it's your job. You don't have to defend the whole media. I think the way you kind of defend the media is just doing your job well and saying, okay, well, it was deflecting basically on what we were trying to ask him about. So he denied having said the comment. Then the Atlantic the next day published audio where he did in fact say that comment. And so we just kind of reconstructed it also the next night to follow up on it, saying, here's what he said, here's what we asked him, he denied it, here's the audio. And that's kind of how it works. But we thought it was an important thing to pursue because there are 9/11 truthers out there. 9/11 did happen. It's not a conspiracy. There's no evidence there were federal agents on the plane. Everyone has looked into this. And I just think if you're running for president, you have a responsibility with your platform. And he has a big platform. He's on the debate stage. He has a lot of followers. He has a big reach. And so it was kind of a thing where we took something that not everyone was asking him about, which we like to do with a lot of the 2024 candidates. We try to find something that maybe they don't know that they're going to get asked about and then follow that up, because I think it's effective and I think it's a good tactic. So I think when you're interviewing someone, it's always good to look for something that maybe they've said, but no one's really followed up with them on, because a lot of politicians will just say things over and over again and no one questions them on it. It happened with Rick Scott and Medicare and Social Security. He had kind of been saying the same thing over and over again. And I fact checked it. I looked into it, and what he was saying was wrong. So we had him on, we told him it was wrong, and we asked him to explain himself. And I think that's a really important, if you're covering lawmakers, that's a good path to always pursue, is to just, a lot of them just don't get follow-up questions. And that's where you make the news a lot of the time. And then he called me a petulant teenager, but it was fine. I think the other thing also, and I learned this from covering Trump, is if you're covering someone and they insult you or try to kind of pull you into a fight, it's best to just stay above it, because your job is to report the news, to hold them accountable. It's not to get in an argument with them. And I just don't think that's always an effective way. And I think the number one thing you do as a reporter is establish credibility with your audience. And I want to be able to interview someone like Vivek Ramaswamy, and even his detractors or people who love him can both watch the interview and think, well, those are fair questions. He should answer those questions. I want it to be something that is not just, for one audience. As far as your second question, it's a great question. I think it goes back to working hard and not saying no. When I started at CNN, that was a big thing. I worked every weekend, every holiday, late hours, 10 p.m. I'd be at the White House till 10:30 p.m. And I just did it with a smile on my face. I think it's a good thing to always be a happy warrior, and I think your bosses will always appreciate it. And, I think throwing yourself into the work is a really great thing to do when you're young and you have maybe fewer life responsibilities in a certain dynamic. And the way I viewed it was really not about, well, if I work 8 days a week and never say no, I'll succeed. I kind of viewed it more as, I can't believe I get to do this, and this is so exciting. And I want to do this interview. And it never goes away, because last year on New Year's Eve, all my friends were going to this house in upstate New York. I had just moved to New York. I was like, I'd love to come. We're in the car on the way there, and Gretchen Whitmer's office called and asked if I wanted to come interview her when she was inaugurated for her second term the next day. And I'm sitting there in the car, thinking I don't have a blazer, I don't have anything. But I was like, you know what? I would have a great fun weekend with my friends, but they'll understand. And I really want to go interview her because I thought she was super interesting. She nearly thought she was going to lose. Michigan, not only was she reelected, Democrats got both houses for the first time in 3 decades. And it was a super interesting story. You know what? I was standing outside in East Lansing the next day. It was 22 degrees and it was raining. And it was not fun. But it felt really good to be there because it was an interesting story. And I went to her house and she was feeding her dogs. And I met her husband and her sister. And it was just really a cool story. And so I think it just comes down to doing things like that and being willing to say yes when a lot of other people want to say no.
Hi, I'm Julian with McClatchy. Kind of really following up on that, how do you explain to people who are outside journalism in your life when you're making a decision like that to drop everything and go there? And for two, do you have more free time now? Do you even want it? And how do you decompress, I guess, from this constant work that you're taking?
It's a good question.
Because we're just coming off of a session on dealing with stress.
Okay.
And how reporters deal with stress over their job, balancing personal life, and editors who are not very willing to take no for an answer.
Yes, there are many of those. On the first one, I think it's a part of living in DC was a benefit because people here kind of get it. I feel like they understand more. Journalism is such a big industry here that I feel like everyone here feels like they know a journalist, so everyone kind of understood. But I have a lot of friends who are totally outside of journalism and news, and they don't work on Capitol Hill, they don't work in the White, they have nothing to do with government. And it's helpful actually to have conversations with them because I learn kind of like what their news awareness is. And that is really helpful, I think, for any coverage you do. You want it to appeal to people who know everything about what you're writing about and people who know nothing about it. Because like when I read the New York Times and I'm reading a story about what avocado farming is doing in Mexico and how it's benefiting the cartels, I don't know a lot about that, but they write it in a way where I'm super interested in it. And so I think anytime you're approaching the news, you do want to think of your friends who maybe aren't super involved, and how would you tell that story to them if you're at dinner catching up with them and you want to fill them in. As far as understanding, my friends are really understanding. I'm very lucky, but you know, it is kind of just you will live a different lifestyle as a reporter than if you have a 9-to-5 job, because reporting is never 9 to 5, because you're always keeping up with what's happening with your beat. You know, the news doesn't stop just when you leave the office. On the other side of that, though, it is really important to have a balance and not to just be constantly online and to take moments for yourself. And I have not always been good at this. And I'm always, you know, worried that I have FOMO when it comes to the news in a real way. And so I'm always like, well, what am I missing? Like if I'm like at dinner for an hour and I'm not looking at my phone, you always benefit though from doing that. And I always try to prioritize if I'm at dinner with my friends that I'm not on my phone a lot. If I'm at dinner with my family that I'm not on my phone a lot. There are some times when exceptions are made. And I think the other part is you will have bosses who constantly want you to work and to report and to let them know what's going on. You do have to take time for yourself though, whether it's in the morning, you're going on a walk and listening to a podcast, in the evenings. You really have to take moments to turn your brain off because it makes you better. If you give yourself that time, then you come back, I think you're a better reporter and you're less burned out. Same with vacations. Like I was thinking about this. I was in a friend's wedding a few summers ago and it was gonna kill me, I think, to be off for 2 weeks. Like I couldn't imagine leaving for 2 weeks, which sounds demented. But I'm at this wedding and it was when the submarine drama was happening with the White House, AUKUS, and I was like missing all of it. And it was when all of the, like France was so mad at the United States and there was this huge diplomatic struggle. And it was going back and forth and I was monitoring it from my phone. And I was like, I can't do anything about it. Like I'm in a different country, I'm just gonna put my phone down. And I came back and the story had totally blown over and no one is talking about that story today. And so it just puts it in perspective that there are some moments where it's a huge story and you don't want to miss it. There are a lot where the news is always going to be there. There will always be something else that happens. And so it is important that you take time to kind of recharge and get out of the news bubble and talk to people who aren't involved in it, because all of that will help make you better at your job when you come back to it.
Thank you, Kaitlan, for speaking to us today. Like the college football playoffs, we could be in uncharted territory soon with perhaps a Trump re-election in 2024. You've covered him as a White House correspondent and Biden as an anchor and White House correspondent. And so, you know, what's your thought process or how are you going to approach going into perhaps covering Trump again? Because we've had Peter Baker and Christine Brennan just today say like it's going to be unprecedented. What do you think about that?
I love Peter Baker and Christine Brennan both so much. And Peter's an amazing White House reporter. I think we will be in complete uncharted territory if Trump is reelected. And he could be. I think it's something that people are taking more seriously this time around than they did in 2016 when no one took his candidacy seriously. And I think, you know, what I always want to be careful about in my reporting is false equivalency and, you know, what Trump has done and what he's accused of and what we could be on the horizon of is unlike anything we've ever seen in this nation's history. And there's a huge swath of people. I'm about to go home for Christmas to Alabama. There's a lot of Trump voters there who fully believe that he should be president again. And so I think you can't underestimate that there's a strong portion of the country that believes that. I think as a reporter, our job is to make sure that we're covering it, you know, not like we did in 2016. I think the game has changed. I think people understand Trump more and they understand his tactics more. And I think what we've been hearing from sources, and the New York Times and others have been doing great reporting on, is what he would use a second term for. And I think that's really the focus for covering Trump this time around is what would he do as a president who doesn't have to worry about re-election, who has the Republican Party, in his grasp so firmly that they'll do basically whatever he wants. And I think it's that perspective covering it of what that's going to look like and making sure voters know that, because that's really your responsibility as a reporter, is to let people know, here's what's at stake. Here's what this is going to look like. It's not, well, here's Trump's healthcare policy and here's Biden's healthcare policy. It's if it is the two of them, it's such a different view of what is Trump and what are his allies planning to do with the federal government if he's back in charge. And they're making plans for it right now. They're thinking of which lawyers they can hire that would, instead of saying no to him like they did when he was in the White House the last time, that they would say, okay, let me figure out how to get that done in a way that's legal. And so I think that's a really interesting, that's basically the Trump story right now, because it does look like he is headed for the Republican nomination. You never know until it's sealed, and so we'll wait to see. But I do think that is, we're going to be in unprecedented times. And so I think that shapes the coverage, and not saying that everything is a 5-alarm fire, because you want viewers to trust you. You want Democratic voters, Republican voters, independent voters, people who don't vote, to all be able to watch your coverage, to listen to your coverage, to learn something about it, to be more informed. And that's what's going to potentially shape their decisions. And I think that's really important when you think about that going forward and what that's going to look like.
Brian Metzger with Business Insider. Wanted to ask you 2 questions if I can. One is kind of more broadly, as you look back at the last 8 or so years of your career, if you have any sort of regrets or things you wish you'd done differently, things that you've learned from, that sort of thing. And then kind of following up on what Arthur was asking, I mean, you obviously had that town hall with Trump not too long ago, and I'm curious, I'm not sure what I thought about it, but I think it was obviously very widely panned, and I'm curious, like, what your reflections on that were.
Yeah. Wait, what was the first part of your question?
Just regrets.
Oh, regrets. That's actually a good one, because I think, as I was saying, on the job training, like, you're not going to walk into your first job or your second job, or even, wherever you are, like even in my day-to-day basis right now, and love every single decision you make or the way you approach things. Even now, sometimes I'll get out of an interview at 10 p.m. when the show's over, and I'm like, I should have asked this question. Like, I'll write it down too, in case I interview that person again. I always have like a million regrets if I've done an interview and I haven't followed up on something that later, you think I should have said this or I should have asked that. That is just something that happens all the time. Or I wish I'd covered this this way or interviewed this person. That's just constant. And I think you don't want to kind of harp on that, but how do you learn from that? How does it make you better the next time you go do an interview or you go do a report? And so I wouldn't say I have any specific regrets, but I just think in general, I think about first covering the Trump White House in the first few years. Every day was so crazy. And, you'd be walking to the White House and he would tweet something about, Stormy Daniels calling her horseface. And that would be the driving story that day. But maybe something was going on in the background with Stephen Miller and immigration that was actually more substantive and maybe something that we should have also covered. And so it's balancing judgment, and that is something that could be certainly we're doing in the near future. What's actually affecting people? Because, the border separation policy was actually affecting people. And so I think that is kind of, I just try to learn from it though. I'm not, the fog of war is real when you're covering things and you're in the middle of it. That's real. But I just think it's, okay, how can I be better next time? How do I learn from this? On the town hall, a lot of people did not like it. And I think a lot of it had to do with the audience, and that part of it was that we knew going into it what the audience was going to look like. And I don't think it's a surprise that Republican voters like Trump. I mean, he's 40 points ahead of every other primary candidate for a reason. And so we knew in New Hampshire, these are Republican and Republican-leaning independents. Those are the people who are going to be voting. You're not going to have Democrats in that audience because it's not we're not in the general election. I think when you're in the general election, certainly. And preparing for that town hall, I watched every town hall Trump did in 2016. I spent so many hours rewatching everything. I could probably tell you a quote he said in 2015. It's insane. But I watched it and it was kind of the same thing. I watched one that he did with Anderson Cooper in Wisconsin, and the crowd was super lively It was the day that, if you even remember this, because it was a million news years ago, Michelle Fields was a reporter covering his campaign. Corey Lewandowski, the campaign manager at the time, grabbed her arm. It was a whole thing. That was what the town hall started about. It was going back and forth, and Trump defending his campaign manager and saying he had no problem with what he did. And I was watching it like, oh my God, I cannot believe 20 minutes of a town hall was focused on this. It was such a big story. He was so dismissive of the story. And it kind of just like took me back. But I was watching the audience there, and then I was thinking about the audience that we had. And they weren't too dissimilar. I mean, Trump voters, they like Trump. And I think when I prepared for it, I was ready for that, so it didn't surprise me. I think people who were sitting at home, it surprised them. And we should have better prepared them to say, this is what you're about to watch. This is what you're about to see. But do I still think it's important that we did it? I do, because I do think Trump is popular. He could very well be reelected. Pretending like that's not going to happen and that that's not the reality on the ground for a lot of the country, I don't think is the way to cover him. I think we should be smart about how we cover him. I don't think anyone has ever accused me of not calling Trump's lies out, and I think he would certainly tell you the same. But I think it's important to press him on stuff. And he had not done an interview with an outlet that was not Fox or conservative or friendly to him since he left office. He'd never been pressed on January 6th in a live interview. We spent 35 minutes at the top talking about January 6th. And so I just think that kind of stuff is really important. And the one anecdote that I'll share from that, and this is a story, it's not data, my dad, a lot of people in my family are Trump supporters. And my dad doesn't really watch the news a ton. He'll watch a few minutes. He watches my show, but he doesn't watch really anything else. And he called me the day after that town hall. We spent 45 minutes talking politics. And my dad couldn't believe, he just never watches a full Trump interview. He'll watch something friendly or something, whatever, but he never sees him being pressed. And I think it shifted my dad's view of it because he watched and actually listened in a way that, a lot of voters who aren't like us, who aren't in the news cycle, aren't paying attention every single day and watching it so closely. And I think for those people, I think they were served by the town hall. But I get it had a lot of criticism, and I'm not dismissing that or saying that it isn't genuine, but you have to make tough choices when you're in the news business.
Andrew James with Fox. I just want to kind of go off on that. You talked before about, trust and trying to build trust with there, but in general in the media, there's been continually decreasing in trust just in the news in general. And you can't have a 45-minute conversation with everybody. I know you've experienced that for being out with CNN, and these people come in maybe with a conclusion more than sort of an open mind. And I was just wondering, how do you think you're going to approach going forward, building that trust, or what do you think the media needs to do in order to build that trust?
It's tough because when you're a reporter and you're out there and you're going to these events, and there is such low trust in the media. I mean, when you look at how they poll it between Congress and us, it's like a race for the bottom. And that really worries me because I know how I approach the work. And even if we ever make a mistake or get it wrong, we apologize, we correct it, we try to kind of inform viewers what happened. This happened, for example, with the Al-Shifa hospital bombing recently. And obviously, Hamas was accusing the IDF of bombing it. The IDF was saying we didn't, but they didn't have any evidence initially of what happened there. And headlines and TV banners inaccurately were saying just one side of it. That is a moment where it's happening so quickly, and you can't always see, hindsight is always 20/20, but that's so important to be really thoughtful in your coverage. As a reporter, it's gonna be so easy to say, well, this person told me this, we're gonna publish it. You've got to make sure you take a beat, check with if someone's accusing someone of something or you're reporting and you feel pretty good about it, but you're not sure, you'll never regret double checking it. Even if you're not first and you can't, tweet it out as a scoop, you'll never regret taking that moment because it works for your credibility. And your credibility as a reporter is everything. And you want to make sure that you can, have that out there and feel confident in your reporting and that people trust you. And so for the media at large, I single-handedly won't be able to fix that. I know that and I recognize that. But I do try every day, every night, every time we report something to do my best to make sure it's accurate, that it's fair, that everyone feels like they've had a say in it, and that people from who are typically Fox viewers or CNN viewers or MSNBC viewers can watch it and get something from it. And I think that's really important. I think it's kind of one reporter at a time. Making sure you do that and treat people fairly is really the way to do it. And it kind of comes back to what I was saying at the beginning, which is all of this is about people. And there are people at the center of your stories, whether you're writing about someone who got fired, hired, a family whose loved one has been taken hostage in Israel. You have to just make sure that these people who do not have the platform that we have, that you're doing justice to what's happening in their hometowns, what's happening in their countries, and telling that story in a way that's genuine, that's informed, that's smart, and that's fair. And that's really the only thing I can feel that is within our power in this room to help reestablish that credibility, because I do think it's really important. I think a lot of it is out of our hands. I think CNN, for example, Trump going to war with CNN, obviously he did so with the Post and the Times as well, but every day going out there and telling millions of people who are loyal to him that CNN is fake news, it resonates with people. And maybe they don't even personally have any issues with something that we reported, but when they hear it, day to day from someone that they vote for and they believe should be in power, it has an effect. And so I think when you're dealing with that, you're dealing with misinformation and disinformation on Twitter, which is everywhere. You're up against a big fight. And you've got to just make sure that at the end of the day, you feel good about your credibility and you feel like you can back up what you're saying, basically.
When you say fair, there's obviously a dispute over, depending on what cohort of people that you talk to, about what fairness means and how we go about being fair. And wondered if you could talk a little bit about what that means to you.
I think it probably means different things to some people. I think I don't know if Vivek Ramaswamy would say that our 9/11 interview was fair. I certainly felt that it was, and that we gave him, we just quoted him and gave him an opportunity to respond. I think fairness is, it's not a hard definition that every single person would agree to. But I think, when I think about it, there were times when I was covering Trump and Biden where we reported something and they really did not want us to report it. And you'll encounter this resistance. They will go to great lengths to get you to change the story, water it down, back off of it, maybe not publish it. I think what you do there is you make sure the people that you're talking to are operating in good faith, because you'll have people naturally, their job is to spin the press, and you want to make sure that you're cutting through the bullshit and that you see what's really happening. But also, if they're acting in good faith and they're saying, if you publish this, it's going to ruin your career, you want to see what are they talking about. Let me go back and double check with these sources, because you want to make sure you have that credibility. And I think, I had people who we'd report stories on a national security decision that Trump was making. I'd get a call from a spokesperson at like 2 a.m. screaming at me about the story. And we'd say, okay, we hear you, your denial's in here, but we have 4 sources on this and we feel good about it. And we'd publish it and the story would be right. And months later, that person would call me about something else. And I would be like, okay, well, remember when you screamed at me about this story and it ended up being right? That's how they lose credibility as a spokesperson. And so you just have to keep all of that in mind. And it's a lot to balance. But I think what you have to know is trust your sources, make sure that they're not spinning you. You're not going to have every single person be a forthcoming, good, reliable source, but make sure that you have the ones that are good and that you can rely on. And you're making a judgment call, really, to make sure that you are being fair. We had one person that we had allegations about his behavior when he was working in the White House, which it was a security clearance issue, it was all these allegations. And we're very careful about what we publish, what we can back up, what's maybe too far for us to publish that we feel like we need to get more sourcing on. And we'll, hold that and make sure that we have more on that. But I think that a lot of these people that we cover, maybe they don't like what we cover, but it's true. And they don't want it to come out, but it does, and it's fair. So I think that's kind of how we approach it, in the sense of, are you being fair? Are you reading their denial? Every time we report on Trump and he's in court, his spokesperson will send a statement this long. I'm not going to read the whole statement on air. I'm like, but I'll acknowledge the parts of it where you're denying what's at the heart of this. They know that. And so I think that's kind of the approach to it.
Over here.
Just another question looking ahead to 2024. I think it's been interesting that we've seen, Roe v. Wade, what happened with that. Abortion has still been a major movement
Yeah.
on the campaign. What other topics or what other, issues you think might be big issues next year that maybe we don't realize or, maybe could be bubbling up? And then what are some election stories you feel like we don't cover enough of? Or, oh, I only did one, but I wish we did more on this topic during an election season?
That's a great question, both of those. On the first one, you never know, because at this point, I think COVID had not happened yet before the 2020 election, which blows my mind to think about. And so it's, I remember we were talking about the economy and immigration and what that was going to look like, and those were going to be the deciding factors. And then it got completely blown out of the water. And we were like, who do we talk to at the CDC? Like, does everyone source up at the CDC and HHS? And so it's kind of, saying, be prepared to pivot. That is going to be key. And a lot of hearing what voters want to talk about, it's like listening to voters, because we've had these moments where we've seen polls. There's going to be a red wave in the House, or what we were just talking about, November 7th, I believe it was this year. What were those elections going to look like? All of these governors, Republicans were going to win, we thought. And then you saw something completely different. And so I think one of the best things to do for elections is the polls are interesting. I think they're usually a good snapshot of what's going on in the moment, but talk to voters and see what they think. And that also helps with credibility, I think, is hearing them out and saying, well, I heard this person who said his entire vote will come down to age, and he doesn't like the age of these candidates, and that's how he's feeling about this. Or the economy, or they don't like immigration proposals and what that's going to look like. Listening to the voters is such a key part of that, and just kind of seeing which way the wind is blowing. Abortion has been an incredibly energizing issue in a way that we had Hadley Duvall on, and if you don't remember her, she is the 21-year-old woman who was in the Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear's ad, and she was one who was raped by her stepfather when she was 12 years old. And we were talking about what today's laws on abortion in Kentucky would mean for her. She was 12 years old. No exceptions for rape or incest. And we had her on the show, and it was such a powerful moment just to hear from her, a 21-year-old woman who this is her story that she was willing to come forward in an ad and talk about. And a lot of it really obviously resonated with a lot of women, because a really red state reelected a really blue governor. And so it's just listening, I think, to people like Hadley Duvall and others as you approach your reporting. And sometimes the most interesting interview is not a candidate or a lawmaker, it's a voter, because they're the ones who actually decide. And that's why I love election night, because it's like, for everything we talk about and report on, we actually get to see what people think, how they feel. And so I think it's such a good snapshot into that. That's what I love election day. It's like the best. For your second question, I think there are a lot of things that don't get covered. Obviously, local journalism is completely obliterated these days. And just, it is so sad to watch what's happening, because I knew growing up, local news was like what I read. And I never read the New York Times or the Washington Post. I read local news in Alabama. And that's what people in Alabama cared about, because it talked about things that were important to them. And that's another thing I think with credibility is people used to know reporters in their hometown. Maybe they didn't like them. I know the people in Alabama who hate their jobs and love their jobs the most are the sports reporters, because they have to report on Alabama, sometimes critically. And people in Alabama don't love that, unless you're an Auburn fan. And so, but it's important, that they're reporting on what's happening inside the Alabama basketball team and the scandal that they had this year. And those are things that you shouldn't gloss over. But on a bigger scale, and not to tie everything back to Alabama, which I understand I've been doing every answer, but redistricting in Alabama and our congressional map and what's been happening with that, and how the GOP in Alabama has fought every step of the way to not adequately, align the districts, to where the Supreme Court basically smacked them down and said, okay, stop, you have to do this, has been something fascinating to watch. It's a huge waste of taxpayer money in Alabama for them to keep having these legal fights over this. It's not an accurate representation of the state. And it's a really big deal when the House of Representatives here has such a narrow margin. It could truly affect whether or not they can get things passed. Things like that really animate me, and I care about them. And every night, we're like, we want to do this story, we want to do this, and we could have like 4 hours of TV to fill, but obviously, you've got to make and choose. But I think part of that is you've got to say, this story is important. No one else is reporting on it. I'm going to be the one who does. And I think that's something that as a reporter, you also want to be looking for those stories that other people are missing. You can't just report what everyone else is reporting. You've got to find something else that's maybe a little bit different. And don't be afraid to go down that route just because no one else is. Tell that story. It's really important. And people, every time we cover local issues like that, they're local issues, but they have national importance to people. And so that's always something I'm keeping an eye on and looking for. It's a good question.
Hi. I was wondering, looking back at your career, if you could maybe reflect on the people and the relationships that you have found to be the most helpful in terms of like either giving you advice and shaping like how you approach your own career, and even just being your advocate when it comes to new pivotal moments of your career.
It's key. That is like the key to success, I think, in growing as a reporter, is you're going to ask 100 people to go to coffee. 90 of them will probably tell you they're too busy. For the 10 who do, though, it can make such a difference. And it's following up with people who, if there's someone whose career you like, in New York, and I did this in DC, whenever young journalism students would reach out to me for coffee, I almost always tried to go, even if shit was crazy and things were going down at the White House, because I know how much that would have meant to me, and I don't ever want to miss that moment for someone. And so I think a big part of it is finding people who are good mentors, and don't be afraid to ask them. I still ask people for advice to this day. Going to Israel, I was talking to a lot of people that I trust about what's not being reported, what angles do you think we're missing. I talked to people who loved our coverage, thought it was amazing. I talked to people who thought our coverage was missing perspective from Gazans and what they were going through. And I think that's really important, because you want to have an awareness of everything that's going on and what that looks like going into it. I still talk to one of my college journalism professors. I actually just saw him after the Alabama game a few weeks ago. He still gives me a ton of advice every day. When I first started reporting on the Trump White House, I did not know how to cultivate a source. I was like, how do you get a source? And I texted this professor who had been very helpful to me when I was in college. And he was so great. He was like, they're people. They have families, they have lives. Yes, they work in the White House, but talk to them like they're people. Take them out for coffee. Don't just say, I need an on-the-record quote from you about this story immediately. Get to know them, build that trust with them so they feel like they can trust you. And he was so helpful in something that seems so obvious and simple, but something that I didn't feel like I knew a lot about whenever I got started reporting. And a big part of it since being at CNN has just been learning from our amazing reporters. When Barbara Starr was at the Pentagon, I would call her if I had a question about Afghanistan and just kind of get her thought process on that. If there are certain producers who were helpful, constructive criticism is your friend. It will only make you better. Be open to it. Not everything you do is going to be perfect and great. And so the only issue with that is if you don't learn from it. How do you learn from it? That's what I try. I know I'm going to make mistakes. I know there will be things that I report or interviews that I conduct that people don't like. I just try to learn from it and make it better the next time. And so I think developing a network of people that you used to work with, that were your professors in college, that are fellow reporters, is one of the most helpful tools that you can have as a reporter. And it's really important to just take them to coffee, pick their brain, ask how they approach their interviews or their work, and just learn from them, I think, is really effective.
Hi, Joseph Choi with The Hill.
Hi.
Kind of jumping off that question, as others have mentioned, your career has shot up very quickly, and looking back, what are some lessons you've learned in terms of like navigating this industry? You went from a relatively smaller online network outlet to a very large, one of the major cable networks. And looking back, what do you think served you in navigating this whole process, and what were some things that in hindsight you would have rethought?
I think it's good to work at different I came from the Daily Caller, obviously very conservative leaning, now pretty conservative leaning when I was there before Trump took office. And then obviously going to cable news and at CNN, they're wildly different. The resources level is different. I mean, but also the bureaucracy is different. At Daily Caller, it was kind of like you did whatever you wanted and you had some direction, but you weren't, it wasn't as stringent and you didn't have, clearly defined beats like what it is at CNN. What? Right. So it's very different. And so, I'm not saying either is better or worse. I think you can learn from both, and both experiences have helped me. But when I got to CNN, I was like, whoa, like it kind of blew me away because I wasn't used to the level of resources and what it looked like and just how big it was. And so I think it's also helpful to work at places that obviously the Daily Caller has an ideological leaning. Honestly, I think it helped make me a better White House reporter because I was kind of there during the rise of Trump, and I watched, how conservative media responded to Trump initially. They also thought Trump was never going to be the Republican nominee, much less the president. And so to kind of watch how that progressed actually informed me and made me a better White House reporter, the way I approached the subject, I think. And I kind of knew the players in the game, like Steve Bannon, Stephen Miller, that whole crew. And so it wasn't a shock to me when Trump would do, when the Muslim ban happened when he took the White House. It wasn't a shock because, when he was saying things, you could believe that those proposals were real because we knew who was kind of writing them in the background. And so I think it's in life, when you're approaching where you want to work, what you want to do going forward, I think take each job for what it is and for where you are, and working somewhere that has fewer resources and less clearly defined beats can actually be helpful because you have more independence and you can kind of pursue what you want to pursue and see where that goes. And it's a smaller environment to work directly with your editors. That can actually be really beneficial in shaping and helping you learn more. If you're at a large organization, ton of resources, a lot of room. Obviously, CNN puts everything it has when something happens overseas, Ukraine, Israel. But also, it's really big, and you can get kind of lost. And so you've got to make sure you're fighting to stay involved and in the know. And so I think that is kind of how I viewed it. I think both have been really helpful in different ways. And so I think, when you're taking a job, any job can be great. You can learn anything from what position you're in. And I think if you're always looking for what's next, it will, you might miss what's in front of you, what you're doing right now, and how that could help you what you're doing next. I never thought I'd work at CNN. I never thought I'd be on TV. I never did broadcast journalism or anything like that in college. It just wasn't really on my radar. And it's been great, and I've really enjoyed it. And I think I just take the approach to it of, this is what I learned from doing this. Here's how it's helping what I'm doing now. And maybe it'll help what I do in the future. Who knows? Great paper. Great paper.
Hello? Hello? Okay. All right. I want to ask about this tension I think everybody kind of deals with between, at the one hand, you're representing your masthead, on the other hand, your byline. And at a place like CNN, where it's not just your byline, it's also your face, your voice, you as a person, very much tied to your work, but also you're kind of representing a company like CNN, which is what CNN is. How do you kind of strike that balance between representing your company and its interests and balancing that with, your own reputation, your own interests, things like that?
Well, I think if you're working for any outlet, you are representing that outlet. And when you go interview someone, a lawmaker, if it doesn't go the way they like and they want it to go, they're not just blaming you, they'll blame the organization as a whole. So I think you always have to be aware of that if I go and conduct an interview, I don't do it selfishly. I think about, okay, well, I've got all my colleagues, not at stake here, but, they view us as a monolith. And so you've got to make sure you're kind of holding up your end of the bargain and that you're doing the best you can, because I want to make my colleagues, proud and happy to work alongside me. And so that's kind of how I think about that. At the end of the day, it is you. You are the reporter. You are the byline. You are the one doing it. You want to be able to report a story, do an interview, speak about something on air or write about something, and go home at the end of the day and feel good about how you did it. CNN's not going home at the end of the day collectively and thinking how Kaitlan Collins did that interview. They're thinking, what's next? And the benefit, I think, of being at CNN is we don't have a certain editorial approach, except it's the news. Like, that is truly what drives everyone. I know there are some critics who don't like CNN. I understand that. There are some people who never turn CNN off and it's like burned in the corner of their screen. Breaking news, CNN. It comes from all over. But I truly, after working at CNN, there's a million different people from different backgrounds, different experiences, different approaches to the news. The one thing that drives everyone is news. Today on our editorial call at 9 a.m., we were all talking about Dana Bash's interview yesterday with Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal on the sexual abuse and sexual violence that happened on October 7th. It was a really compelling interview, and I think anyone could take something from it and learn something from it. But that's what we were talking about, because it made a lot of news. And so I think it helps when where you work, that's what they care about, and that's the driving force. You know, as Ted Turner always used to say about CNN, no, the people are not the stars. The news is the star. And I do think that is completely true. And in our biggest moments, you can see that. I think when you're thinking of how do you balance I think you have to, if you're approaching a story, and maybe this isn't what you meant, so tell me if I'm wrong, but are you saying, like, if you're approaching a story and your editor doesn't agree with your approach or thinks it should be different?
Yeah, or if, like, for example, like editorial leadership has a certain idea of how we should be framing a story or something like that, but you on the ground feel that that's not the correct approach or something like that, but they're really kind of pushing you in a certain direction, or they really want you to focus on a certain thing. Like, how do you kind of like manage that tension that might arise?
So I think there's two ways. One is, do you trust them? Are they people who have good judgment? Have they been in the business longer than you? Do they have a reason that they're pushing that? Do they have a perspective that is informed by experience and knowledge? I trust that. And, you know, if someone has covered Israel for 20 years and they're saying, well, you know, the IDF's going to bullshit you on this, so be careful going into this interview, I want to listen to that, you know, and this is a hypothetical, I'm just making that up. I want to listen to that. But I also know I'm the one doing the interview. And we have this discussion on my team all the time, because I always want, you know, producers on my team to suggest, if we're doing an interview with Tommy Tuberville, suggest a question or what you think. And I will take those ideas. But at the end of the day, I'm the one in the chair. I'm the one asking the questions. I'm the one who's going to get the shit on Twitter if it goes astray. And so you kind of have to push back. I do think there is a way, though, and, you know, when I was covering the White House, sometimes our bosses and certain editors would think, this is the story. Those of us who were covering it said, no, it's this. They listen to you. If they're a good boss or a good editor, they will listen to you. And I have always found that my pushback has always been, if you approach it in the right way, and obviously with an open mind, and here's why I think this, it's driven by my reporting, my experience has always been that people listen to that. So don't be afraid to speak up, because that's your job. That's why you're there, and the editor is in an office editing. They're not in driving, you know, what's going to be the story that day. You're the one actually doing the reporting. And so it's your job to go. Uvalde is a good example of this. Shimon Prokupez, my colleague, is amazing. He was actually there, and he knew right after that shooting happened, when everyone else, you know, was rightfully focused on the victims and what happened, he knew something had gone wrong, because he's covered a lot of shootings. And he was hearing about the police response. And when you're first hearing about that news, I mean, we all know now what went wrong in Uvalde, and it's the subject of many investigative reports. It was not totally clear in the initial aftermath of that shooting, but he was on the ground. He called our bosses and said, this is the story, actually. And they listened, and we took it in that direction. And so you should push back, and you should raise your concerns. And if there's a certain editorial direction and you're not comfortable with it, don't do it, because the only person that you're accountable to at the end of the day is yourself. That's a good question. That's a really, it's something you kind of learn in the moment, but it's good to speak up, and you're there for a reason.
And that's probably a good answer to end on. I think in the end, we all have to trust ourselves and our judgment. So,
yeah,
wonderful.
These were great questions. I can't believe no one else asked about football, but these were really good. Really thoughtful and really informative. And what I said earlier about always being willing to, like, provide advice, it may not always be perfect or great, or may not have the answer, but you can always email me, Kaitlan.Collins@CNN.com. I try to respond to, like, every single email. So feel free to ever send me a note with any questions you have.
Boy, that's dangerous.
I know, but I mean it, because it's helpful. That's like how we all get better. I think the industry as a whole getting better builds our credibility and will help things going forward.
Well, and that says a lot about her taking the time to come and talk to us today. We really, really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thank you guys for being here.